Housework. For many, it is the most tedious part of the day. Most of us dread having to come home and hoover the dust out of the carpet, or do that stack of dishes that we've been putting off for days. For some of us, maybe someone very kindly does the housework for us. For others, maybe we do other people's without any thanks. Regardless, most of us must do housework at some point in our lives, and most of us don't enjoy doing it. Now imagine a world where all you did every day was housework. Maybe for some it is less difficult to imagine. A world where it was frowned upon for you to go to paid work, and instead your finances depended entirely on what someone else was willing to give you. Add on top of this, children, who you must spend every waking moment caring for without any help from your partner. For many working and middle-class housewives in the early 20th century, this was the reality. The role of the housewife is arguably contended and varies according to one's household income and status in society. In her groundbreaking book Housewife, feminist theorist Anne Oakley defines the role of the housewife as being composed of three parts: mother, wife, and household maintenance. I have used Oakley's definition as it most suitably covers the housewives we will be examining in this essay, namely women married to men, usually with at least one child. I will predominantly be looking at heteronormative households within this essay, as whilst it would have been interesting to cover chronological households from LGBTQ+ backgrounds throughout the 20th century, I did not have access to suitable resources to tell this story. As time went on in the 20th century, it became normal for women to go to work and for the housework and childcare to be shared amongst the household and even the government, perhaps damning the figure of the 20th century housewife to arguably become a thing of the past. But even today there are still inequalities, and for many the view persists that housework is more of a woman's responsibility than a man's. Therefore, I wanted to explore and answer the question of, what is the relationship between women and housework? How has this relationship changed in Britain across the 20th century? And why is the figure of the housewife so controversial today?
My mum, she still does. She's a housewife through and through.
I say it was pretty balanced in my house. Like, my dad did certain things and then my mum would do certain things. Because you could count housework as, like, cleaning the garden and doing stuff like that. So, like, my mum never did that stuff. It was my dad that did that. But he'd also do the laundry. But then my mum would cook and clean. So it was very, like, balanced in my house. I've had a good parents to look up to, I think. Yeah, 100%. 100%.
My dad, probably.
I would say it was a fairly even split. Well, at least my parents would claim it was an even split, but I think that my mother does end up doing more of the housework in terms of just the unseen labour. So like online shops or like putting the washing out and doing stuff that kind of goes unnoticed, or like if she asks my dad or the kids to do stuff and it's not done by the end of the day, then she'll pick up the slack. But then again, I suppose there's also a split. Like, I'd say my dad does more of the cooking and like DIY, which I suppose you could label as like more typically like masculine roles in the household.
For a lot of my life, it was just my mum as the parent figure, so it was kind of down to her. Because it was a single parent household, there was also a lot of chores put onto me and my sister, which not everyone necessarily experienced. But when my stepdad came into the picture, my mum typically does like the cleaning of the house, but my stepdad will be the one to cook and things like that, so it is divided.
My mum, yeah, because my dad would work like a lot later hours and she would come back to pick us up and, you know, make us dinner and do all of that stuff. So growing up, it was definitely my mum.
I think that it's not women's work, but men perceive it as not their job, so it just falls to the woman.
I think it depends on the role, but at the same time, it's equal. Because, like, you can both do the work. It doesn't have to be one job. Just
depends if you like it. For example, I won't touch rubbish. I will do all the other stuff. Oh, I hate hoovering as well, so I can't do hoovering. Like, that's one thing I can't do. Drying dishes. I'll clean dishes, won't dry them. It's just like, me and my partner will split that in half. And so he'll dry the dishes while I clean them, or like, I'll put his washing in the laundry as long as he hoovers the place and stuff like that. So we split jobs. It's just depending on what people like. So it's not necessarily a masculine or feminine job. It's more who likes doing what and who can, like, is willing to do it.
Is different from family to family. I think like the stereotype that's a feminine role does still prevail, and that is the reality for a lot of people in a lot of households. So it's arguably more of a feminine role in that sense.
I think depending on culture, I think for my culture, then yeah, it is a woman's job to cook and clean and do all the housework, for sure. I'm Punjabi, I'm Indian, so yeah, it's very traditional, I guess. Like, the roles are very, like, women are domestic and men are more like going to work and all that.
I think society definitely views it as a more feminine role still, obviously not as much as it used to be. So like, sort of the figure of the angel in the home, and just the idea that women were either took up a masculine role in the workplace or stayed at home and you were a housewife. But now it's definitely more varied. I don't know, I think it's just more covered up. So like, I know people always claim like, oh, why is feminism still a thing when we're equal now? But I think in terms of like hidden labour, emotional labour and all of that kind of thing, housework as well, women definitely take on more of a toll.
Yes, definitely. I think it's easy enough to do for either parent. It's not like a set job for either one. For example, I grew up with a stay-at-home mum. My partner grew up with a stay-at-home dad. So it's like we've got both perspectives. And this is like, yeah, main thing. Can be either way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my dad's kind of a housewife. My mum goes and works.
The idea of the housewife is an inherently gendered figure because it comes from the belief of femininity as being sort of meek and submissive and domestic. And I think that's so ingrained in the figure of woman in our society that like it would take a lot of like reprogramming the way we view gender to make it a non-gendered role.
Just from speaking to 6 of my friends in Swansea, we can see there is a wide range of households and household dynamics in Britain, each with their own nuanced situations. We can also see the range of perspectives on what constitutes a housewife. One thing is clear, many of my friends talk about an equal split of the housework in their families between male and female figures. However, whilst none of my friends believed that housework was objectively a feminine role, there was a recognition from some that it still is more closely linked to women than to men, but that this was an improvement from the past. I am aware that this sample size is very small. Asking more people would lead to potentially very different results, as well as asking people of different age groups and ethnic backgrounds. But from speaking to those around me, I can conclude that the relationship between women and housework today has in fact changed for the better. Yet there remains a certainty that things are not completely equal. But how did we get here? And what was the situation in the past that they are referring to?
As with the commander of an army or the leader of any enterprise, so is it with the mistress of a house. Her spirit will be seen through the whole establishment, and just in proportion as she performs her duties intelligently and thoroughly, so will her domestics follow in her path. Of all those acquirements, which more particularly belong to the feminine character, there are none which take a higher rank in our estimation, than such as enter into a knowledge of household duties. For on these are perpetually dependent the happiness, comfort, and well-being of a family. She who makes her husband and her children happy, who reclaims the one from vice and trains up the other to virtue, is a much greater character than ladies described in romances, whose whole occupation is to murder mankind with shafts from their quiver or their eyes.
These are the words of Isabella Beeton, written in her famous book, The Book of Household Management. This mammoth text contains detailed instructions on how to be the perfect wife, how to be a good mother, and how to run a household, as well as containing 220 recipes for a housewife in 1861 to recreate in her kitchen. Whilst her recipes are delicious and are still used today by many people, it is her detailed instructions on being the perfect housewife that speak volumes on standards of how a stereotypical woman ought to act at the turn of the 20th century. Beaton's book highlighted how she very much believed that it was a woman's role to carry out all of the household tasks. These were attitudes that persisted and were predominantly unchallenged throughout most of the early part of the 20th century. Women at the time did not have access to many rights without having a husband, and therefore were resigned to being a housewife. Whilst during the World Wars there were propaganda images of the American Rosie the Riveter calling women to action with her muscular arms and overalls, as well as other lumberjills in the UK who were drawn to inspire women to work, the overall view never changed, and reverted back to the belief that women belonged in the home after the wars were over. This caused much anger for many women, particularly those who were used to working and who were then replaced by men returning from the war. The reality of the lack of rights for women became really apparent at these moments. This resulted in those working class women without husbands being pushed to the margins of society, and those who did settling back into the role of the housewife. Whilst I was conducting my interviews, one of my friends, Paige, said something that caught my attention. For context, we were discussing the nature of housework and whether it was actually in fact work at all.
I think it needs to be done, but I think that there should definitely be more equality in that across all people living in a house. Like typically, if you live with your partner, it would be like they think they should get points for doing the dishes, or they wash the clothes. It's like, oh, I've done this for you. But there shouldn't be recognition for that, no matter who does it. And so no, I don't think it's a job, but I do think that some people think it is when they shouldn't.
What Paige is saying here is very interesting. Since housework is an everyday part of our lives, there is no need to consider it work. She mentions the idea of a point system, the idea that something should be received for doing everyday tasks like housework. However, Paige is talking about a scenario where there is already established equality between the people in the household. Perhaps in a state of inequality, there is a need for points or some sort of reward for a permanent work. In the 1970s, a movement arose across the UK which spread like wildfire, involving women from all around the world. It was called Wages for Housework, and it involved women demanding the recognition that they deserved for their work within the home. These images are from an art exhibit at the Tate Britain entitled Women in Revolt, Art and Activism in the UK from the 1970s to 1990s. I went there in order to find out more about this movement and the visual activism of the women involved in rebellion against being the passive housewife only. But let's pause here. Before we go any further into all the good stuff and explore what unfolded in the 1970s with women fighting back against patriarchal society, I first need to put the labour of housework into perspective. Today, doing the laundry consists of opening the drum, tossing in a pot of detergent, putting the clothes in, shutting the drum, and pressing start. That's 5 steps. It does not require that much physical exertion. Going back 62 years to 1961, and this is the first washer-dryer that also spins, it looks very similar to how ours look today and operates in pretty much the same way. But when I found an ad for this Benedict's model on eBay, the ad overtly connected housework to women, being told from the perspective of a woman trying to convince her husband to buy her a Benedict's Triomatic. The fact that she had to convince her husband in the first place shows that she does not have financial independence, which stays in alignment to Mrs. Beaton's era views of women, despite being exactly 100 years on from her book. However, this was a top-of-the-range model costing the equivalent of £2,000 back then, according to the Science Museum's information, and most households would not have had access to this. This is the twin tub invented in the 1930s and popularised in the 50s, one washed and one dried. It was all manual, filled by a hose, clothes moved from one to the other, and wastewater extracted. The drying just removed excess water without actually drying the clothes. It was really a glorified mangle. Washing would have taken a good few hours out of the day with these. Now, this barrel-looking thing is a washing machine in the 1920s. It stood on a motor which moved the clothes around, but that was it. The water had to be heated up manually, poured in manually, and removed manually. It required a lot of patience and a whole day's work, particularly if you had lots of children. And now, back to the 1900s. There were many steps required to do washing in this copper pot. First, the water had to be boiled on the stove, then the clothes had to be soaked, then separated, then the soap was grated into the pot. It required a lot of heat and gas to operate, and would have taken around 4 hours of stirring the clothes by hand per batch of laundry. This really was a laundry day for housewives at the start of the 20th century. Compare these old-fashioned things to today's machines and you get the picture. Household maintenance was a full-time job for women, and the labour intensity of these old machines lingered long into the 1970s, as many households could not afford to upgrade to newer models. But back to wages for housework. The movement started with Silvia Federici and several other women from Italy and Britain, but was put into words when Federici and the Power of Women Collective published the 1975 manifesto in Bristol, entitled Wages Against Housework. It was communist in nature, and chalked women's work in the home up to being unpaid labour that was assisting capitalism. Federici outlines how because there is a lack of separation between the housewife's life and the housewife's work, it is not fair labour. It ought to, therefore, be recognised as work and credited as such. She writes, "The demand for a wage makes our work visible, which is the most indispensable condition to begin to struggle against it." This movement required images, and there were many groups such as the See Red Women's Group who took it upon themselves to produce posters representing the unjust nature of housework without pay. Here's one of my favourite posters that I found out about through the exhibition, done by a member of the See Red Women's Group, a group that created feminist posters and graphic design for protests from the 1970s to the 1990s. This one's entitled "My Wife Doesn't Work." Posters like this highlight the lack of recognition for the work of the housewife, and show how much time was spent on housework. The husband's lack of recognition for women's work highlights how tasks that are traditionally carried out by women are not taken seriously, because of the view of women as second-class citizens. Essentially, housewives could be free labour because they were also considered the property of a man. However, this arguably began to change with legislation. In 1970, the Equal Pay Act was passed, which entitled women who were on work of the same or a broadly similar nature to that of men to equal pay. Whilst this act was very positive in terms of legislation protecting women, there was still an encouragement to leave work once a woman fell pregnant, as there was no such thing as paid maternity leave until the 1980 Employment Act. This is because there wasn't access to state-provided or formal affordable childcare. The exhibition also displayed a range of women's schedules covering what work they did outside of the home. These schedules look exhaustive and show the types of jobs that were considered to be women's work for working-class women up and down the UK. The early mornings showed how the women juggled and adapted their schedules to incorporate the housework and childcare, as they were still expected to carry out these tasks. There was very little leisure time, demonstrated by the fact that resting and sitting down was considered noteworthy in their days. Outside of the activism, there was backlash which arose against women working outside the home, stemming from male scientists, including the likes of John Bowlby, a prominent British psychologist from the 1930s to the 70s. Bowlby's work on attachment in infants led him to propose the theory of maternal deprivation, suggesting a correlation between criminality and an absent mother. According to Bowlby, children have an innate need to bond with their mothers, and there's a critical 2-year period during which continuous maternal care is crucial. This theory was employed in the family-oriented 1950s to push women out of the workforce, especially after their roles in munitions factories were taken over by returning male workers. Bowlby's theory, influential in its time, still echoes today. However, a reassessment by psychologist Rutter in the 1980s to the early 2000s challenged Bowlby's ideas. Rutter argued that Bowlby overemphasized the mother's role, highlighting instead that children benefit from stimulation and care from various close individuals. This more inclusive perspective on caregiving recognises the importance of a supportive environment with multiple caregivers. While Barbie's work left a lasting impact, subsequent research has expanded our understanding of the diverse factors contributing to a healthy child's development. Today, attitudes towards women in the home have improved, but there remains the notion that housewives' work is unfulfilling and menial. Yet it must be taken into account also that the degree of labour that is required for housework has decreased dramatically. There is also less stigma surrounding women going to work, and there is paid maternity and paternity leave in most places of work in the UK. According to the Department for Education, by September 2025, struggling parents will be able to apply for 30 hours free childcare a week, a massive improvement from the current limit of 15 hours free childcare. I wanted to finish off by taking a break from wider history and show you some history that is personal to me. When I told my mum about this project, she mentioned that she has my grandmother's diary from 1975, which she kept religiously throughout the year. In this, she predominantly documents the weather, a phrase or two about what she did that day, and what food she bought for the household, including the price of it.
So lots of things about the weather, very wet much of the day. Weather was particularly important for my mum and dad because dad was a market gardener, so that relied on being able to grow things. So grandma's also documented here how she would help with that business. She's planted daffodils and planted marrows. Grandad did a lot with flowers, so grandma helped as much as she could with that as well. Grandma also documents things about what she did, like I cleaned the cupboard shelf and went to the market. But Grandma was also a supply teacher, so she talks about the days when she did some supply teaching as well. A lot about laundry, did the washing and ironing, and she documents the weather being sunny that day, so she would have done lots of washing and ironing because it was a big deal to get it dry. And here we also have some things of prices and the shops that she went to and the different things that she bought. And Robarts was a local shop, a very small supermarket that sold everything. And in those days we also had like half p. So in Robarts this week she spent 54.5 one day and £2.13.5 another day. We had a milkman, so this would have been the milk bill for the week, £1.64 that she would have paid directly to the milkman. And then we also went to the village butchers, so this is pork from the butchers, £1.50. She puts in here all the things she's bought each week from the local shops and the prices that go with those. So very much focus on practical things that she's done, lots of talk about the weather and also about us as her children and what we did. So my sister Elizabeth going to France and returning from France on a school trip is noted. And then a nice day out for her, which would have been very unusual. Went to the Chelsea Flower Show and it was sunny and warm. So that was a real treat for Grandma in those days.
We can see that she is solely in charge of purchasing the food and that she occasionally worked as a supply teacher. Whilst there are no timings in here, her days are busy and are not unlike the schedules of the women that we saw in the museum. This diary is only one of many that she kept, and helped me to realise the value of housework in the past, how time-consuming it was and remains to be today, and the importance of recognising housework and the women that perform it as heroines. Overall, I think it's important that moving forward, housework should be ungendered, not simply expected to be carried out by women and feminine-presenting people. It is also important that housework is recognised as work and celebrated as such by all. Finally, I hope that we recognise the struggle of the work of feminist movements who brought to our attention how the relationship between women and housework is built into the foundations of a patriarchal society and is inherently unhelpful for creating a fulfilling vision of Britain as a society of equality.